Questions for Chapter 2, Supply and Demand. If you ask me anything, I don't know. I'm not going to answer. Yogi Berra. Brown square equals exercise is available on my Econ Lab. Star equals answer appears in the back of the book. Blue capital V equals video answer by James Dearden is available online. 1. Use the supply and demand diagram to explain the statement. Talk is cheap because supply exceeds demand. At what price is this comparison being made? 2. The 9/11 terrorist attacks caused the U.S. airline travel demand curve to shift left by an estimated 30%. Ito and Lee, 2005. Use a supply and demand diagram to show the likely effect on price and quantity. Assuming that the market is competitive, indicate the magnitude of the likely equilibrium price and quantity effects. For example, would you expect equilibrium quantity to change by about 30%? Show how the answer depends on the shape and location of the supply and demand curves. 3. When he was the top American administrator in Iraq, Paul Bremer III set a rule that upheld Iraqi law. Anyone 25 years and older with a good reputation and character could own one firearm, including an AK-47 assault rifle. Iraqi citizens quickly began arming themselves. Akram Abdul Zahra has a revolver handy at his job in an internet cafe. Haidar Hussein, a Baghdad bookseller, has a new fully automatic assault rifle. After the bombing of a sacred Shiite shrine in Samarra at the end of February 2006 and the subsequent rise in sectarian violence, the demand for guns increased, resulting in higher prices. The average price of a legal Russian-made Kalashnikov AK-47 assault rifle jumped from $112 to $290 from February to March 2006. The price of bullets shot up from 24 cents to 33 cents each. Jeffrey Gentleman, sectarian suspicion in Baghdad fuels a seller's market for guns. New York Times, April 3rd, 2006. The increase occurred despite the hundreds of thousands of firearms and millions of rounds of ammunition that American troops had been providing to Iraqi security forces, some of which eventually ended up in the hands of private citizens. Use a graph to illustrate why prices rose. 4. The Federation of Vegetable Farmers Association of Malaysia reported that a lack of workers caused a 25% drop in production that drove up vegetable prices by 50% to 100% in 2005. Vegetable price control sought thestar.com.my June 6, 2005. Consumers called for price controls on vegetables. Show why the price increased and predict the effects of a binding price control. 5. Soon after the United States revealed the discovery of a single mad cow in December 2003, more than 40 countries slapped an embargo on U.S. beef. In addition, some U.S. consumers stopped eating beef. In the in the 3 weeks after the discovery, the quantity sold increased by 43% during the last week of October 2003, and the U.S. price in January 2004 fell by about 15%. Use supply and demand diagrams to explain why these events occurred. 6. Ethanol. A fuel is made from corn. Corn production increased 5.5 times from 2000 to 2008 at ethanolrfa.org. What effect did this increased use of corn for producing ethanol have on the price of corn and the consumption of corn as food? 7. The prices received by soybean farmers in Brazil, the world's second largest soybean producer and exporter, tumbled 30%, in part because of China's decision to cut back on imports, and in part because of a bumper soybean crop in the United States. The world's leading exporter, Todd Benson, a harvest at peril, New York Times, January 6, 2005, C6. In addition, Asian soy rust and deadly crop fungus is destroying large quantities of Brazilian crops. A. Use a supply and demand diagram to illustrate why Brazilian farmers are receiving lower prices. B. If you knew only the direction of the shifts in both the supply and demand curves, could you predict that prices would fall? Why or why not? 8. On January 1, 2005, a 3-decades-old system of global quotas that had limited how much China and other countries could ship to the United States and other wealthy nations ended. Over the next 4 months, U.S. imports of Chinese-made cotton trousers rose by more than 1,505%, and their price fell 21% in the first quarter of the year. Tracy Rozon, a tangle in textiles, New York Times, April 21st, 2005, capital C1. The textile industry demanded quick action, saying that 18 U.S. plants had already been forced to close that year, and that 16,600 textile and apparel jobs had been lost. The Bush administration reacted to the industry pressure. The United States and Europe, which faced similar large increases in imports, pressed China to cut back in textile exports, threatening to restore quotas on Chinese exports or to take other actions. Illustrate what happened and show how the U.S. quota reimposed in May 2005 affected the equilibrium price and quantity in the United States. 9. After Hurricane Katrina damaged a substantial portion of the nation's oil refining capacity in 2005, the price of gasoline shot up around the country. In 2006, many state and federal elected officials called for price controls. Had they been imposed, what effect would price controls have had? Who would have benefited and who would have been harmed by the controls? Use a supply and demand diagram to illustrate your answers. 10. Argentines love a sizzling steak, consuming twice as much per capita as U.S. citizens. Thus, when the price of beef started to shoot up, Argentina's President Nestor Kirchner took dramatic action to force down beef prices. Larry Roeder for Argentina's sizzling economy, a cap on steak prices. New York Times, April 3rd, 2006. He ordered government ministries to cease their purchases, prohibited the export of most cuts of beef, and urged consumers to boycott beef. But beef-loving Argentines, benefiting from higher wages due to a growing economy, largely ignored his call. When these actions failed to lower prices substantially, he turned to voluntary price controls, encouraging grocery chains and others not to raise prices for extended periods of time. Use graphs to illustrate this sequence of events. Between 1971 and 2006, the United States, from time to time, imposed quotas or other restrictions on importing steel. Suppose both the domestic supply curve of steel, capital S superscript D, and the foreign supply curve of steel for sale in the United States, capital S superscript F, are upward sloping straight lines. How did a quota set by the United States on foreign steel imports of capital Q bar is positive affect the total American supply curve for steel, domestic and foreign supply combined? 12. Given the answer to question 11, what effect does a U.S. quota on steel of capital Q bar being positive have on the equilibrium in the U.S. steel market? Hence, the answer depends on whether the quota binds is low enough to affect the equilibrium. 13. Will Mexico stop producing tequila? Because of record low industry prices for the agave azul plant from which tequila is distilled, farmers in Jalisco and other Mexican states are switching to more lucrative plants like corn, which is used for the now trendy ethanol fuel alternative. Kyle Arnold, No Mas Tequila, The Monitor, September 17, 2007. Planting of agave rose substantially from 2000 through 2004, and it then started to plummet as the price of inexpensive tequila fell. The number of agave planted went from 60 million in 2000 to 93 million in 2002 to 12.8 million in 2006, and the downward trend continued in 2007. It takes 7 years for an agave plant to be ready for harvesting. The price of inexpensive tequila has dropped 35% to 40% in recent years, but the price of high-end tequilas, which have been growing in popularity, has remained stable. Discuss the relative sizes of the short-run and long-run supply elasticities of tequila. What do you think the supply elasticity of high-quality tequila is? Why, if the demand curve for inexpensive tequila has remained relatively unchanged, is the demand curve relatively elastic or inelastic at the equilibrium? Why? For years, Anthony Calise, his wife, and their 4 children traveled from Dallas, Pennsylvania to South Bend, Indiana, where they rented a house for $1,200 a weekend so they could attend Notre Dame football games. On the weekend of the 2006 home opener against Penn State, someone else arranged to rent this house months earlier, and another house recommended to him at $3,000 was also taken. A parking pass sold for $500. and a pair of tickets with face prices of $59 went for $3,200 for the Penn State game on eBay. Hotel prices and the cost of restaurant meals are also much higher on football weekends than during the other 341 days of the year, particularly in years when Notre Dame is expected to have a winning season. Elon Bratt, why fans paid through the nose to see Notre Dame. Wall Street Journal, September 7th, 2006. Use a supply and demand diagram to illustrate why, when the demand curve shifts to the right, the prices of hotel rooms and rental apartments shoot up. And carefully explain the shape of the supply curve, taking into account what happens when capacity is reached, such as when all hotel rooms are filled. 15. The application substitution may have endangered species describes how the equilibrium changed in the market for seal genitalia used as an aphrodisiac in Asia when Viagra was introduced. Use a supply and demand diagram to illustrate what happened. So show whether the following is possible. A positive quantity is demanded at various prices, yet nothing is sold in the market. 16. According to Borjas 2003, immigration to the United States increased the labor supply of working men by 11% from 1980 to 2000 and reduced the wage of the average native worker by 3.2%. From these results, can we make any inferences about the elasticity of supply or demand? Which curve or curves changed and why? Draw a supply and demand diagram and label the axes to illustrate what happened. The United States Bureau of Labor Statistics reports that the average salary for post-secondary economics teachers in the Raleigh-Durham Chapel Hill metropolitan area, which has many top universities, rose to $105,200 based on a 52-week work year in 2003. According to the Wall Street Journal, Timothy Appel, economists gain star power, February 22nd, 2005, A2. The salary increase resulted from an outward shift in the demand curve for academic economists due to the increased popularity of the economics major, while the supply curve of PhD economists did not shift and the quantity supplied did not change. A. If this explanation is correct, what is the short-run price elasticity of supply of academic economists? B. If these salaries are expected to remain high, will more people enter doctoral programs in economics? How would such entry affect the long-run price elasticity of supply? 18. What effect does a $1 specific tax have on equilibrium price and quantity, and what is the incidence on consumers if the following is true? A. The demand curve is perfectly inelastic. B. The demand curve is perfectly elastic. C. The supply curve is perfectly inelastic. D. The supply curve is perfectly elastic. E. The demand curve is perfectly inelastic, and the supply curve is perfectly inelastic. Use graphs and math to explain your answers. 19. On July 1st, 1965, the federal ad valorem taxes on many goods and services were eliminated. comparing prices before and after this change, we can determine how much the price fell in response to the tax's elimination. When the tax was in place, the tax per unit on a good that sold for P was alpha P. If the price fell by alpha P when the tax was eliminated, consumers must have been bearing the full incidence of the tax. Consequently, consumers got the full benefit of removing the tax from those goods. The entire amount of the tax cut was passed on to consumers for all commodities and services that were studied for which the taxes were collected at the retail level, except admissions and club dues. And for most commodities for which excise taxes were imposed at the manufacturer level, including face powder, sterling silverware, wristwatches, and handbags. Brownlee and Perry, 1967. The list the conditions and terms of the elasticities or shapes of supply and demand curves that are consistent with 100% pass-through of the taxes. Use graphs to illustrate your answer. 20. Essentially none of the savings from removing the federal ad valorem tax were passed on to consumers for motion picture admissions and club dues. Brownlee and Perry, 1967. See question 19. List the conditions and terms of the elasticities or shapes of supply or demand curves that are consistent with 0% pass-through of the taxes. Use graphs to illustrate your answer. 21. Do you care whether a 15-cent tax per gallon of milk is collected from milk producers or from consumers at the store? Why or why not? 22. Usury laws place a ceiling on interest rates that lenders such as banks can charge borrowers. Low-income households in states with usury laws have significantly lower levels of consumer credit loans than comparable households in states without usury laws. Villegas, 1989. Why? Hint, the interest rate is the price of the loan, and the amount of the loan is the quantity.